Hi there, my name is Emmanuel Mukoni from MSTutors, and today we'll be looking at an introduction to financial mathematics. So let's begin. Now, suppose that you got money. It can be from your savings, it could be from your inheritance, or maybe you got lucky and you won the lottery. Whatever reason, the point is you have the money and the reason is kind of irrelevant. And so it may be that maybe you robbed a bank or something. But at the end of the day, you have the money and you want to invest the money. Now, when it comes to investments, you need to familiarize yourself with the terms that are used in the investment industry so that you can be able to trace your investment and know about the growth of your money, right? So now let's look at some of the terminologies that are used in the investment industry. The first one is the principal amount. Now, the principal amount is represented by the letter P, and this is the amount that you invest at the beginning of your investment period, right? So this is the money that you're going to take to the bank or to any other investment firm to invest your money. So let's look at the second one, which is the interest rate. And the interest rate is represented by the letter I. Now, this is the amount of interest that you will receive per year expressed as a proportion of the amount that you have invested. So let's say that you invested 100 rands and are earning and you earned 10 rands interest. So this means that your interest rate would be 10%, right? Now, okay, let's continue and look at the third one, which is the period. The period is represented by the letter N, right? And this is the time in years that it will take for your investment to reach maturity. And by maturity, we mean that the time at which you will be allowed to cash out from your investment, right? And the last definition is the accumulated value represented by the capital letter A. Now, this is the total amount of your investment by the end of the investment period. So it's basically the principal amount plus the interest that you have earned throughout the investment period. Right? So this is the amount of money that you're going to cash out by the end of your investment. Right. Now there are two ways of investing, and so it's basically two ways of earning interest. And let's look at those two ways. Now we have what we call simple interest and compound interest. So for simple interest, we can see the formula that we use to calculate the accumulated value for simple interest. And the graph also shows us how your money will be growing. The money will be growing in a linear fashion. Now, for compound interest, you can also see the formula. The graph also indicates that your money will be growing at an exponential rate. So that's the difference between these two ways of earning interest. Now let's dig deeper into each of these two ways. We'll start with a simple interest. Now with the simple interest, the interest that you're earning at the end of each year is a fixed percentage of the principal amount. So as you have already seen, the formula for simple interest is A equals P into 1 plus I multiplied by N, right? Close bracket. And so let's look at this example of simple interest. So the example says that you invest 1,000 rands at a bank for 4 years. Now, the bank offers 10% simple interest per year. Now, how much money will you cash out by the end of the investment period? Right. We're given P, which is 1,000. We're given N, which is 4. You're given the I, which is 10%. So I think it's best if we look at the accumulated value by the end of each year. So accumulated value by the end of the first year would be the money that you invested, which is 1,000 rands, plus the interest that you earned for that year, which is 10% of 1,000 rands, which is the 100 rands. And by the end of the first year, the accumulated value will be 1,100 rand, right? By the end of the second year, it will be the accumulated value after 1 year plus the interest earned during the second year, which is the same as the interest that was earned in the first year, which is that 100 rands. So you earned 100 rands in the first year and you earned 100 rands in the second year. And the accumulated value after 2 years is 1,200 rands. After 3 years, it's the same thing. You earned an extra 100 rands. So you end up with 1,300 rands. And the fourth year, which is the final year of your investment, you end up with 1,400 rands. So basically, after 4 years, you shall receive 1,400 rands. That's your accumulated value, right? Now, let's look at what we would get if we were to use the formula for calculating accumulated value on simple interest. So you just plug in the values that you were given, and you see that we also get the 1,400 rands. So this equation confirms that you will receive the 1,400 rands after 4 years. So now, from now onwards, you know that you instead of doing the method that we did of doing it for each year, you can just plug in the values into this formula to find the accumulated value, right? Now, we cannot just use this equation without knowing where it came from. Let's do some proof. I'm going to derive the equation, and it's basically about just using first principles. So this is the accumulated value. The accumulated value at time n is equivalent to the P, which is the principal amount, right? Plus the interest that you earned for the first year, which is IP, plus the interest that you earned for the second year, which is another IP, because for simple interest, the interest that you earn each year is fixed, right? So it's plus another I times P, which is the interest for the third year. So you keep on adding those IPs up until the nth IP, right? Which is the interest earned on year n, right? So looking at this equation, we can see that we have a common factor, which is P, the principal amount. So we can factorize and factor out the P. And this is what we get. We get the accumulated value is equal to a P, then within the bracket will remain with the 1 plus the I, interest rate, plus the I for each of those years. And as we already know, there are n number of i's in this bracket. So we can simplify that and say it's going to be P into 1 plus I multiplied by n, because there are n number of i's in this equation, right? So now you can just remove the bracket and you'll end up with the equation that we had, which is the equation that we used in that example, the previous example, right? So now we have derived the formula. We can now use it comfortably, right? So that's simple interest. Let's move on to compound interest. Now for compound interest, the interest earned by the end of each year is a percentage of the principal amount plus the interest earned in the previous years. So you are basically earning interest on interest, right? And this is the formula for calculating compound interest, and you will use this formula to calculate the accumulated value. Sometimes they'll give you the accumulated value and you'll be required to find the principal amount or to find the period. It will depend on the question and what you're required to find, right? Now, another example, which is similar to the previous example. You invest 1,000 rands at a bank for 4 years. Now, the bank offers 10% compound interest per year. How much money will you cash out by the end of the investment period? Right. Now, this is compound interest. Do not forget that. So, by the end of the first year, the accumulated value would be the principal amount multiplied by the compound interest, which was 10%. So you'll end up with 1,000 rands and 100 rands. So that's the accumulated value by the end of 1 year. So it will basically increase by 10%, which was the 1,000 multiplied by 1.10, which implies 10% growth, right? So after the second year, it will grow, the funds that are in your investment account will grow by another 10%. The 10% will now be applied to the principal amount plus the interest that you have earned in the first year. And when you combine those two values, you had 1,100 rands. So that amount for the second year has to grow by 10%. So after 2 years, the accumulated value is going to be 1,210 rands, right? Okay, let's look at the accumulated value after 3 years. We can see that after 3 years, the accumulated value will be the 10% growth of the funds in the account at the beginning of year 3, and this is going to give us 1,331 rands, right? So after 4 years, it's the same thing. We'll have the 10% growth of the funds in the account at the beginning of year 4, and you'll end up with 1,464 rands and 10 cents, right? So we can see that after 4 years, you'll end up with the 1,464 rands and 10 cents, and this is the funds that you're going to receive by the end of your investment period, right? So now let's use the equation, the compound interest equation, and see what we'll get. So you just substitute the values, and we can see that we end up with the same value, which is 1,464 rands and 10 cents, right? So now this equation confirms that you will receive the same amount, which is the 1,464 rands and 10 cents after 4 years, right? So now this means that in the future, you can just use this equation to calculate the accumulated value instead of doing it for each year, right? Now, we cannot just use this equation without knowing where it came from, right? So we'll do a little proof. We'll do a little proof for this equation, and instead of going the long way, we'll just do a short proof whereby we will be reasoning by analogy, right? So now let's look at the accumulated value at the end of year 1, right? So this is going to be the principal amount plus the interest, and for the first year, which is going to be the interest rate multiplied by the principal amount, right, which is the IP, which is the second term on your right hand side, right? So now we can see that we have a common factor, which is P, and we can factorize that, right? Now I want you to take a good look at the exponent of the 1 plus I, right? It's 1, right? And take a good look at the subscript of the A, which is the accumulated amount, which is also 1, right? They're equal for the first year. You need to take a note of that, right? Now let's look at the accumulated value by the end of year 2, right? So now we see that the accumulated value is going to be the funds in the account at the beginning of year 2, which is the first term on your right hand side, plus the interest earned in year 2, right? And the interest is going to be the interest rate I multiplied by the funds in the account at the beginning of year 2, which is the product of 1 plus I and P. Right. So now in this equation, we see that we have a common factor, which is the product of the P and the 1 plus I. Right. Now we can factorize and we'll end up with this. Right. Now you can just write this in its simplest form and you'll end up with that. Right. Now you need to take note of what we talked about for year 1. Right. Now the exponent of the 1 plus I is 2 and the subscript of A is also 2 for year 2. Now you need to take note of that the exponent is equal to the subscript for the particular year. Right. Now let's look at the accumulated value of the 3 years. It's going to be the funds in the account at the beginning of year 3 plus the interest earned for year 3, which is the product of I and the funds in the account at the beginning of year 3, right? So it's the same thing. We see a common factor, which is the product of P and the 1 plus I squared, right? Now we factorize that, end up with this, and we just write it in its simplest forms. And I think when you write this in its simplest form, you'll end up with that. All right. Now we can see that the exponent of 1 plus I is 3 and the subscript for A is also 3. Now we can see the pattern, right? Now you see that the accumulated value for year 3 is equal to P multiplied by the 1 plus I raised to the 3, right? Now we can see that this pattern will continue even in the future, and for year N you'll end up with the accumulated value at time N is equal to P multiplied by the 1 plus I raised to the N, right? So that's the proof for the compound interest. I think that you can now use the formula comfortably, knowing how it came about. And that's it for this lesson. I will see you in the next lesson. For more information, you can visit www.mstutors.co.za.